There are places on this planet so restricted, so remote, or so deliberately hidden that the overwhelming majority of human beings will live and die without ever getting within 100 miles of them. A few of them you've heard of. Most of them you haven't, and that's not an accident. These are 15 banned places on Earth, so rare most people will never see them. Number 15. Ise Grand Shrine Inner Sanctum, Mie Prefecture, Japan. Japan has over 80,000 Shinto shrines, and the vast majority of them are accessible to anyone who wants to walk through the gate. Ise Grand Shrine is not most shrines. It is the holiest site in the Shinto religion, dedicated to Amaterasu Omikami, the sun goddess and mythological ancestor of Japan's imperial family. And the innermost sanctuary of the main shrine, the Naiku, has been off-limits to everyone except Shinto priests and members of the imperial household for over a millennium. The outer areas of the Ise complex can be visited by anyone, and about 8 million people do so annually, walking the gravel paths through forested grounds that communicate a genuine sense of sacred space. But the main hall of the Naiku is hidden behind 4 concentric wooden fences, with each layer requiring a higher level of authorization to enter, and the innermost structure is not visible to the public even from a distance. What the building looks like, what it contains, and what the interior experience is, none of this is documented in any publicly available source, because the people who know are not permitted to say, and the people who want to know are not permitted inside. Every 20 years, the entire shrine complex is torn down and rebuilt on an adjacent plot using the same traditional carpentry techniques, the same hinoki cypress wood sourced from sacred forests, and the same ceremonial protocols that have governed the process since at least the 8th century. The practice is called Shikinen Sengu, and the most recent rebuilding occurred in 2013. The cost of each cycle runs into the hundreds of millions of yen. The physical structure that emerges from each rebuilding has never been photographed by anyone outside the priesthood, and the Japanese public accepts this arrangement as a matter of cultural and spiritual respect that has not been seriously challenged in the modern era. Number 14. Adak Island Naval Facilities, Alaska, USA. Adak Island sits at the far western end of the Aleutian chain, closer to Russia than to mainland Alaska, and the active naval facilities on the island represent one of the stranger cases of a restricted zone sitting inside what is technically a functioning civilian community. The U.S. Navy established a major base on Adak during World War II, expanded it aggressively during the Cold War as a strategic listening post facing the Soviet Pacific, and officially closed it in 1997. Most facilities were transferred to the Aleut Corporation and the city of Adak, leaving a small civilian community of fewer than 200 people living amid the ruins of infrastructure built for several thousand. A set of specific facilities and antenna arrays were not transferred because they remain operationally active under military and federal communications management. Those installations are fenced, marked, and inaccessible to the civilian population sharing the island, which creates the specific absurdity of a 200-person community with a restricted military zone in its backyard that nobody there can do anything about. The island's location within the Aleutian Islands National Wildlife Refuge means broader access is itself regulated, requiring specific authorization for research or commercial purposes. The combination of wildlife refuge status, active restricted military facilities, and extreme weather, Adak experiences some of the most reliably violent storms in the North Pacific, with conditions that can make the single runway unusable for days, creates an effective barrier that makes the restricted military installations almost beside the point for anyone trying to get there in the first place. Number 13. Macquarie Island, Australia. Macquarie Island sits about halfway between New Zealand and Antarctica in the Southern Ocean, administered as a Tasmanian State Reserve and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1997. The island has no permanent civilian population, hosts a small year-round research station with typically between 20 and 40 personnel, and is accessible only by ship from Hobart. a voyage of about 5 days through some of the most consistently rough seas in the world. The island sits on the boundary between the Indo-Australian and Pacific tectonic plates and is the only place on Earth where rocks from the Earth's mantle are actively being pushed above sea level by tectonic forces, a geological distinction that makes it scientifically extraordinary and practically inaccessible to anyone without a research purpose and approval from the Tasmanian Parks and Wildlife Service. The wildlife population includes approximately 3.5 million seabirds, including the world's largest concentration of royal penguins, along with southern elephant seals and fur seals. The island was the site of one of the most extensive island biosecurity operations in history between 2011 and 2014, when a multi-year program eliminated introduced rabbits, rats, and mice that had devastated native bird populations at a cost of approximately 25 million Australian dollars. The program has since been declared successful. The island remains as inaccessible as it has always been, which is precisely why it worked. Number 12. The Mosque of Mecca Grand Sanctuary, Saudi Arabia. The Masjid al-Haram in Mecca is the largest mosque in the world and the holiest site in Islam, and access to both the mosque and the broader city of Mecca is restricted by Saudi Arabian law to Muslims only. Non-Muslims are prohibited from entering Mecca at all, not just the mosque, but the entire city, under regulations enforced at checkpoints on roads leading into the area. The restriction reflects Islamic tradition about the sanctity of the holy city and has been in place, in various forms, for centuries. The annual Hajj pilgrimage draws between 2 and 3 million Muslim pilgrims to Mecca each year, making it one of the largest annual human gatherings on Earth. The logistics of managing that volume of people have driven enormous infrastructure investment, including expansion of the mosque complex to over 356,000 square meters of enclosed prayer space, capable of accommodating several million worshippers during peak pilgrimage periods. For non-Muslim travelers, the restriction means that the Kaaba, the cube-shaped structure at the center of the mosque that Muslims face during prayer, is visible only in photographs. British explorer Richard Burton famously entered Mecca in disguise in 1853, documenting his experience in Personal Narrative of a Pilgrimage to Al-Madinah and Mecca, a journey undertaken at genuine personal risk since discovery would have meant death. The restriction has been consistently enforced since and shows no sign of changing. Number 11. Lop Nur Restricted Zone, Xinjiang, China. Lop Nur is a dried salt lake in the Tarim Basin of Xinjiang in western China, one of the most arid landscapes on Earth, and the surrounding region remains under military restriction because of what China used it for between 1964 and 1996, 45 nuclear weapons tests, making it the Chinese equivalent of Nevada's Nevada National Security Site, or Kazakhstan's Semipalatinsk. The tests included both atmospheric detonations and underground tests, and the environmental legacy of 3 decades of nuclear testing in a desert basin has not been publicly assessed in any comprehensive way because the Chinese government has not permitted independent environmental study of the test areas. The military installation at Milan, Base 21, that housed the personnel of the nuclear weapons program, remains an active military facility, and the broader Lop Nur region is designated as a restricted military zone requiring authorization that is not available to civilian visitors of any nationality. The dried lake bed itself, which was an important Silk Road landmark for centuries, has been inaccessible to ordinary travelers since the testing program began and has remained so since the tests ended. The ecological legacy of the area is complicated by the fact that the Tarim River, which historically fed Lop Nur and maintained it as a body of water, was progressively diverted for agricultural irrigation through the 20th century, causing the lake to dry up entirely by the 1970s, regardless of the nuclear program. The interaction between industrial-scale water diversion, decades of nuclear testing, and continuing military restriction has created a landscape that the outside world has almost no reliable contemporary information about. Explorer Yu Chunshun attempted a solo crossing of the Lop Nur dry lake bed in 1996 and died in the attempt, the last well-documented civilian attempt to traverse the area. Number 10. Surtsey Island Scientific Reserve, Iceland. Surtsey is an island that didn't exist until November 14, 1963, when an underwater volcanic eruption broke the surface off the southern coast of Iceland and kept erupting for nearly 4 years. By the time the lava stopped in 1967, the island measured approximately 2.7 square kilometers of entirely new land that had never existed before in any form, making it one of the youngest terrestrial surfaces on Earth and one of the most scientifically valuable biological monitoring sites anywhere. The Icelandic government restricted access almost immediately after the eruption ended, recognizing that the island represented a unique opportunity to observe biological colonization of a brand new landmass under controlled scientific conditions. Only authorized researchers have been permitted to visit since, in small groups, under strict biosecurity protocols designed to prevent the accidental introduction of any seeds, insects, fungi, or microorganisms from researchers' clothing or equipment. The results of this controlled monitoring have been remarkable. Vascular plants arrived via ocean drift within a few years. Birds established nesting colonies that brought fertilizer supporting further plant growth, and a complex functioning ecosystem has developed on bare volcanic rock within 5 decades. The island is eroding. Wave action has reduced it to about 1.3 square kilometers, but what remains is among the most carefully protected pieces of land on Earth. Access for the general public is simply not a concept that exists here. Number 9. Dulce Lake Wetland Buffer Zone, New Mexico, USA. The area around Dulce in Rio Arriba County, New Mexico, on the Jicarilla Apache Nation Reservation, maintains a set of overlapping access restrictions, tribal sovereignty regulations, federal wetland protections around Dulce Lake, and the general land management rules governing the surrounding Carson National Forest that combine to create a genuinely restricted zone in a corner of northern New Mexico that most Americans have no reason to think about. Dulce Lake itself is a federally protected wetland supporting migratory bird populations, and the surrounding terrain includes land managed directly by the Jicarilla Apache Nation, which exercises sovereign control over its reservation without requiring justification or explanation for its land management decisions. Access to reservation land for non-tribal members requires specific permission from the tribal government, which is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a legal exercise of self-governance by a sovereign nation within the United States. The broader Dulce area became the subject of significant conspiracy theory attention beginning in the 1970s and running through the 1980s, primarily through claims by a businessman named Paul Benowitz, who alleged an underground government alien facility beneath Archuleta Mesa near the town. Those claims were never substantiated. What is documented is that Benowitz was the subject of a deliberate disinformation operation run by Air Force Office of Special Investigations personnel who fed him fabricated information to distract him from classified programs at Kirtland Air Force Base he had inadvertently been monitoring. The area remains genuinely restricted for genuinely ordinary reasons. The conspiracy theories have made it famous for reasons that have nothing to do with what the restrictions actually protect. Number 8. Qincheng Prison, Beijing, China. Qincheng Prison is located in the Changping district north of Beijing, and it exists for a specific institutional purpose. It is the prison where the Chinese government incarcerates its own most senior political prisoners. Senior officials who have been removed from power through anti-corruption campaigns, former senior members of the Communist Party under investigation, and high-profile political detainees have historically been held at Qincheng rather than in the general prison system, a distinction that reflects both the security considerations of housing people with access to classified information and the political sensitivity of their detention. The facility's existence has been documented in accounts by former inmates published outside China and in historical records of senior party officials who were imprisoned there during and after the Cultural Revolution. Former high-ranking officials held at Qincheng have included figures from multiple generations of Chinese Communist Party leadership, and the facility's existence as a designated political prison has been a consistent feature of the Chinese detention system for over 6 decades. The physical location of the prison is known and has been documented by journalists and researchers, but access is, predictably, restricted with the intensity you would expect for a facility housing people whose detention is itself politically sensitive. The Chinese government does not publish information about the facility's population, conditions, or operating procedures, and the accounts that exist come from people who were released after serving their sentences and subsequently published memoirs or gave interviews in contexts where they could speak without consequence. Former Politburo member Bo Xilai, convicted of bribery, embezzlement, and abuse of power in 2013 and sentenced to life imprisonment, is among the most recently prominent names associated with the facility. Number 7. Palmyra Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, Pacific Ocean, USA. Palmyra Atoll sits in the central Pacific Ocean about 1,000 miles south of Honolulu, and it is one of the most pristine coral reef ecosystems in the entire Pacific Basin. The atoll is administered as a national wildlife refuge by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the private land portion owned by the Nature Conservancy. Entry requires specific permits from the Fish and Wildlife Service and is essentially restricted to authorized researchers and conservation staff, with a tiny number of permitted ecotourism visitors granted access through a highly competitive application process. The atoll has no indigenous population, has had only episodic human presence through its history, and the combination of its isolation, the nearest significant land is Hawaii, 1,000 miles away, and the strict access controls have allowed it to function as something close to a control group for what a Pacific coral reef ecosystem looks like without sustained human pressure. The reef fish populations include species that have been essentially fished out of every accessible Pacific reef, and the coral cover and diversity at Palmyra are among the highest documented anywhere in the Pacific. The atoll also has a documented history that is considerably darker than its current conservation status. During World War II, the U.S. Navy used Palmyra as a forward base, and the atoll is the site of a 1974 murder case in which a couple sailing through were killed by 2 other individuals also anchored at the atoll, a case documented in journalist Vincent Bugliosi's 1991 book, And the Sea Will Tell. The murders occurred in one of the most remote locations in the Pacific and went unsolved for years before Bugliosi, who had prosecuted Charles Manson, worked the case to a conviction. The atoll's isolation, which makes it scientifically valuable, also made it a setting for something considerably more grim. Number 6. Arkaim, Southern Urals, Russia. Arkaim is an archaeological site in the southern Ural steppe of Russia in the Chelyabinsk Oblast, discovered in 1987 when Soviet archaeologists surveying for a planned reservoir found the remains of a Bronze Age settlement built roughly 4,000 years ago and then deliberately burned and abandoned by its inhabitants. The site consists of 2 concentric circles of dwellings arranged with geometric precision around a central space, built by people generally identified as Proto-Indo-Iranian and representing a level of architectural sophistication that scholars have spent decades analyzing. The site is protected as a historical and cultural preserve, and access is managed. The archaeological zones within the broader preserve are restricted to authorized researchers, and independent access to the settlement ruins requires coordination with the preserve administration. The significance of the site to Russian nationalist and neo-pagan movements has added a complicated cultural layer to its management, as various groups have claimed spiritual significance for Arkaim in ways that the archaeological administration has had to balance against preservation priorities. The surrounding steppe contains numerous related Bronze Age sites forming the so-called Country of Towns, a network of similar fortified settlements spanning a large area of the Ural-Tobol steppe, and the region represents one of the most significant Bronze Age archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The site's age, preservation, geometric layout, and connection to Proto-Indo-European cultural history make Arkaim of genuine scholarly importance in understanding ancient population movements. Significance that has not made it any easier for a casual visitor to simply walk in. Number 5. Enewetak Atoll, Marshall Islands. Enewetak Atoll is a ring of coral islands in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, and the United States used it between 1948 and 1958 for nuclear weapons testing. 43 tests, including the first hydrogen bomb test, codenamed Ivy Mike, which was detonated on November 1, 1952, and produced a yield of approximately 10.4 megatons. One of the islands of the atoll, Elujalab, no longer exists. The Ivy Mike test vaporized it entirely, leaving a circular crater in the atoll's reef. The people of Enewetak, approximately 145 of them, had been relocated to Ujalang Atoll in 1947 before testing began, with assurances of temporary displacement that turned into over 30 years of waiting. The cleanup of Enewetak Atoll was one of the largest radiological remediation projects the United States military has ever undertaken, conducted between 1977 and 1980 by a team of about 4,000 military personnel. Many of them young enlisted men who were not fully briefed on the nature of what they were cleaning up or the potential health consequences. The contaminated soil and debris were collected and consolidated into a crater from one of the earlier tests on Runit Island, sealed with a concrete dome approximately 115 meters in diameter and 46 centimeters thick, and left there. The dome, known as the Cactus Dome, is not watertight. Rising sea levels and the general degradation of the concrete have allowed radioactive material to leach into the surrounding lagoon water over the decades since it was sealed. The residents of Enewetak were permitted to return to some islands of the atoll in 1980, but Runit Island, where the dome sits, remains off-limits under restrictions maintained by both the Marshallese government and U.S. agreements. The broader atoll's ongoing radiation levels have been monitored and debated, with the Marshallese government and independent researchers periodically at odds with U.S. assessments of safe levels for continued habitation. The dome itself is a physical marker of a decision the United States made about what to do with an amount of nuclear waste it couldn't fully remediate. Leave it on an island in the Pacific and call it solved. Number 4. Javari Valley Indigenous Territory, Brazil. The Javari Valley in the far western Brazilian Amazon, near the borders of Colombia and Peru, is one of the largest indigenous territories in Brazil, covering approximately 8.5 million hectares of intact Amazonian rainforest, and it contains what is believed to be the largest concentration of uncontacted indigenous peoples anywhere on Earth. The Brazilian government's Indian Affairs Agency, FUNAI, estimates that at least 16 uncontacted groups live within the territory, though the exact number and population size is by definition uncertain. They are uncontacted, which means contact-based census methods are not applicable. FUNAI prohibits entry into the Javari Valley for anyone without specific authorization, and enforcement of this prohibition has been the primary mission of a dedicated FUNAI monitoring operation since the territory was formally established in 2001. The prohibition exists for the same reason that applies to other territories with uncontacted peoples: the catastrophic vulnerability of populations with no acquired immunity to common diseases, for whom contact with the outside world has historically meant epidemic mortality on a scale that can eliminate an entire group within years of first contact. The Javari Valley gained international attention in 2022 when British journalist Dom Phillips and Brazilian indigenous rights expert Bruno Pereira were murdered in the territory while traveling to document illegal fishing, mining, and land invasion activities. Their deaths drew attention to both the ongoing threats to the territory from illegal resource extraction and the danger faced by the FUNAI staff and indigenous monitors who attempt to enforce the exclusion zone against well-armed invaders with financial incentives to be there. The territory remains restricted, the prohibition remains in place, and the peoples living inside it continue their lives in complete isolation from the outside world. by choice, by circumstance, and by the active efforts of a Brazilian government agency trying to keep the boundary intact. Number 3. Spitsbergen Polar Desert Interior, Svalbard, Norway. The interior of Spitsbergen, the largest island in the Svalbard archipelago, is one of the most geographically extreme environments regularly referred to as land rather than ice shelf. It is technically accessible to anyone with the right equipment and authorization, but the combination of polar bear density, extreme weather variability, total absence of rescue infrastructure in the interior, and Norway's mandatory firearms requirement for travel outside settlements creates a barrier that functions as effectively as any fence. The Svalbard Treaty of 1920 gives citizens of signatory nations the right to live and work on Svalbard without a visa. But Norway requires that anyone traveling outside the settlements carry a firearm and demonstrate the knowledge to use it. Polar bear encounters at close range are genuinely dangerous and not uncommon. Environmental regulations restrict travel in sensitive areas and prohibit disturbance of wildlife, archaeological sites, and specific protected zones. The polar desert interior contains archaeological sites from early whaling operations, Russian trapper cabins from the 18th and 19th centuries, and glaciers retreating visibly under climate warming, occurring roughly twice as fast in the Arctic as the global average. The governor of Svalbard has consistently applied the territory's protections with the seriousness the environment's fragility requires. The interior remains, for practical purposes, accessible only to those with the preparation, authorization, and specific purpose to justify being there. Number 2. Ise-Shima National Park Inner Zones, Japan. The Ise-Shima National Park on the Shima Peninsula in Mie Prefecture contains not only the Ise Grand Shrine complex covered earlier, but a series of additional restricted zones centered on the sacred forests and coastal areas that the Jingu, the administrative body managing the Ise shrines, has maintained as protected territory for over 13 centuries. The forests surrounding the shrines, known as the Jingu forests, cover approximately 5,500 hectares and are managed under protocols that prohibit not just unauthorized entry, but the removal of any natural material. No fallen branches, no soil samples, no plant specimens. The forest management approach at Ise has been continuous since at least the Nara period, making it one of the oldest continuously managed forest reserves in the world. The trees have grown for centuries without commercial harvesting, and the stands of Sugi cedar and Hinoki cypress represent what old-growth temperate forest looks like without any of the interventions that have modified virtually every other temperate forest in Japan and in most of the rest of the world. Researchers with specific scholarly purposes can apply for limited access, but the application process is controlled by the Jingu and reflects the institution's priorities rather than those of the researchers. The result is a forest that has been studied considerably less than its ecological significance would seem to warrant. A functioning old-growth temperate forest ecosystem in Japan that most ecologists have only read about rather than walked through, which is either a conservation success or a missed scientific opportunity and is probably both simultaneously. Number 1. Dulce Archuleta Mesa Interior, New Mexico, USA. The Archuleta Mesa rises above the town of Dulce in northern New Mexico, and its interior is restricted by a combination of Jicarilla Apache tribal sovereignty, the mesa sits on reservation land, and federal land management regulations governing the surrounding Carson National Forest terrain. What makes Archuleta Mesa the top entry on this list is not just its restricted access, but the layered nature of what its restriction has come to represent in American culture and in the documented history of government information management. Beginning in the late 1970s, a series of claims about the mesa gained traction in UFO research communities, primarily through a businessman named Paul Benowitz, who believed he had intercepted electronic signals from an underground base beneath the mesa jointly operated by the US government and extraterrestrial entities. The claims circulated widely through the 1980s, elaborated in multiple directions, and generated a body of literature that described multiple underground levels, biological experiments, and armed conflict between humans and aliens. What is documented with considerably more certainty is that Benowitz was the target of a deliberate counterintelligence operation run by agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations at Kirtland Air Force Base, who supplied him with fabricated documents and encouraged his most extreme interpretations of the signals he was genuinely monitoring. Signals that were classified surveillance-related and which the Air Force wanted kept away from public attention. The operation, known to investigators as an early documented case of government-directed disinformation against a civilian, was eventually acknowledged in enough detail by enough participants to be considered established history rather than speculation. The mesa itself is mesa-shaped granite and limestone in northern New Mexico, home to elk, mule deer, and the specific silence of high desert terrain. The tribal land surrounding it belongs to the Jicarilla Apache Nation, which has the sovereign right to manage it as it sees fit without explanation. Former AFOSI counterintelligence officer Richard Doty, who participated in the Benowitz operation and has spoken about it in interviews over the years, described the experience as a case study in how effectively misinformation spreads when it confirms what people already want to believe. The mesa remains restricted. The conspiracy theories remain active, and the distance between the two is exactly the distance between a piece of New Mexico high desert and everything that human imagination has projected onto it. If you found this one worth watching, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more out there than most people ever look for.